All right. So, how could remediation be built into a potential US CBDC system, right? Something to keep in mind. And so basically, what is remediation and what are some of the, we'll say, pros and cons of having that happen on ledger, and what exactly does that mean, right? So all of this is taken from a paper published by the Office of Science and Technology from the White House, right? And I'll put a link to that to a PDF of the actual paper itself so you can read it for yourself and so on. But basically, they define remediation as referring to the ability to fix mistakes made with the CBDC system, such as transactions that occurred accidentally or fraudulently, right? And so basically putting that on ledger, what this means is that it's built into the, we'll say, CBDC systems protocols, right? And so this means that, or I guess an example of this would be either voiding a transaction or say, well, transactions can be reversed before final settlement, basically. Final settlement, to articulate that better. And basically what this means is, the central bank just takes care of it, more or less, because it's a central bank digital currency. And I guess you could argue, and this becomes a bigger problem with how we're going to define remediation in general, like how exactly is the governance of this system looking, to which we'll look at, the previous videos I have in this playlist with respect to, say, like having more intermediation, and how many like intermediaries are there, what they're doing exactly, what they're in charge of, and so on. And I'll kind of reference those videos for that aspect of it, right? And so to get into kind of the pros and cons of this on-ledger remediation, right? Having the remediation kind of process built into the system itself. And so basically this could show up as a designated settlement period, basically between the start of the transaction and final settlement, right? And so we'll say that the CBDC is not fully transferred until the transaction itself is fully verified. But this raises a question, at least to me, is what about Fed now, right? Something I talked about, I guess, a few months ago, rather in depth. I did a few videos on it and went over some diagrams and stuff, and that'll be kind of floating around the channel, right? I'll try to put a card or something up in the corner for you guys. But that kind of negates the whole instant settlement point of Fed now in general, so I'm not sure how exactly this would play out specifically for a potential US CBDC, right? And so I'm assuming, they'd probably go more off ledger in that respect, or find some workaround and compensate in some way, right? Again, these are just this is more of just like posing questions and that sort of thing than anything else. Just kind of taking the information from the horse's mouth and going from there, right? So to look on the other side of thing at some kind of negative consequences of this, of having on-ledger remediation. And so this would make the CBDC unusable for a certain period, right? Which kind of defeats the whole financial inclusion point of a CBDC, or at least how they argue for it, I should say, right? Because they're like, the whole point is to have the money or the funds, we'll say, faster in the hands of individuals faster. And they bring up people who live paycheck to paycheck very often, right? And that's one of the major selling points for a potential US CBDC from their point of view, right? And so basically this would disincentivize people to use the CBDC in general because of this kind of settlement period, to where they can't use the funds for whatever the definition is, or however long that time period is. And an interesting fact, I believe it came from a Treasury paper. It's cited in the paper itself, but I don't remember exactly what the title is, so you'll find it whenever you read it. But basically an interesting kind of idea is to have it to where the individual, when they start the transaction, can actually set that settlement period themselves, right? Depending on, say, their trust in the other entity, right? If you're giving it to a friend, maybe you have it be instant settlement, just giving an example, right? And this is, again, just kind of posing questions, so to say. Or like if it's someone who you maybe don't trust, or whatever the case may be, you can have it be like 3 days or whatever, right? Again, just an interesting thought, right? And one thing to keep in mind as another negative consequence of having on-ledger remediation is, and the whole point of having the central bank take care of it, and this kind of goes on to something I've talked a little bit about in the past, where, you know, the whole customer service aspect of it, you know, the central bank doesn't do that now, right? And so to do this kind of remediation process, this is basically a part of that customer service stuff in a way. And so they would basically, you know, like in our case in the United States, the Federal Reserve isn't set up for your run-of-the-mill customer service type thing, right? Especially with respect to transactions. And so, you know, this raises governance concerns, which kind of goes between like permission and permissionless systems. And again, kind of really, this whole point accentuates how intertwined all these US CBDC design choices are, and why I'm kind of trying to go through and break them down piece by piece. I'm just kind of thinking about them in general and then starting to connect the pieces as well, right? Just to gain a better understanding of how all of this works together, right? So a major question for on-ledger remediation is who has the authority or the ability, or I guess or the ability to conduct these transactions in the first place, and what kind of technical features allow them to do so, right? And this isn't like I'm going to answer the question, because this is a question they pose in the paper themselves, and so even they don't have an answer to this as of right now, because you kind of need a generalized, or at least a general idea of some specifics and technical features of the system itself before you can really kind of answer this question, right? And so that's the answer to this question is kind of hidden, so to say, within all the other US CBDC design choices we've been talking about, right? So to keep that in mind, and as kind of a final statement to pull directly from the paper itself, quoting, so remediation would likely be easiest to implement in a permissioned and centralized CBDC system with intermediaries that have visibility onto a ledger and the ability to submit transactions, right? So why did I even pull up this quote to begin with, right? Mostly to take emphasis on the would likely be easiest to implement for a permissioned and centralized CBDC system, right? Which is kind of the more obvious way a CBDC system would go in general, right? You know, depending on your trust, we'll say, in like the Federal Reserve and governments and that sort of thing, and what you believe their reasoning is, it might not be so far out there to believe, you know, it's kind of more of a, they want to centralize this stuff and not have, you know, the commercial banking system be in it at all, or to the same extent as they have been. Basically, and there's this, excuse me, I think this, or it seems to me that this statement itself kind of shows how these entities, we'll say kind of loosely, that they view a potential CBDC as a workaround of the commercial banking system. And so you could see this used for like UBI and that sort of thing and so on, right? I think that argument has been posed rather frequently from what I've noticed whenever I hear people kind of in the space will say, talk about CBDCs, right? So with that being said, I will also put a video in the top right corner for basically taking remediation off ledger to where it's not built in to the CBDC system, and it's basically, you know, retroactive in a way, right? And so that'll be up there, and basically make sure to subscribe, and I'd love to hear you guys' comments, concerns, whatever. The whole point of me doing these videos is to kind of put it out there, so to say, in video format, because I know a lot of people just kind of prefer to consume this sort of information that way. I know it just kind of depends on what I'm doing, and I do the same thing. So just kind of doing that as well. So I'd love to hear you guys' comments. If you have ideas, maybe I missed something, so on, I'd love to hear that, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.